What's the next phase of the war and peace process in Central America? On March 2, 1988, Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, spoke on this question at the Northwestern University campus, sponsored by the Evanston Committee on Central America. Chomsky is the author of numerous books and articles on international affairs and is an expert on Central American politics. Here are excerpts from that speech.
What I wanted to do was focus attention on the coming phase of the conflict, now well over a century old, between the United States and essentially the population of Central America. That's been an ongoing war, an unequal war. The victims are all over there, and there are many of them. It entered a new phase in the 1980s, and it entered another phase beginning on February 3rd, change in the character of this war. And I do want to focus on this coming phase. February 3rd I picked because that was the day in which the Congress, responding to substantial popular dissidence, imposed certain limits on what the World Court called the unlawful use of force by the United States in its attack against Nicaragua. I'll come back to the background and details of that, but let me mention that February 3rd also opens a new phase in another war that's been going on at the same time, and that's a war between our government and its population. Now, that's not unusual. Typically, states regard the general population as an enemy. That's normal. The task and role of the population is to be apathetic, obedient, passive. If it's what's called a democracy, they're supposed to show up every once in a while to ratify elite decisions. But if they get involved in anything beyond that, they're causing trouble, and they have to be controlled, and they're an enemy. Now, among elite groups, there are variation. There are tactical variations, and the Reagan administration happens to be at a rather extreme end of a spectrum, but it's not, the spectrum hasn't changed. It's the old spectrum. They just happen to be extremists within that spectrum, and their fear and hostility of the general population is also extreme. Also, they happen to be pretty open and frank about it, so they tell you if you bother to listen. One of the first things that the Reagan administration did back in the early 80s was to establish within the State Department an institution called the Office for Public Diplomacy, which had the task of controlling public debate and discussion, setting the framework for discussion. So it carried out operations like what they called Operation Truth, which is one that Orwell would have loved, and it had about as much relation to truth as you would expect something to have with that title. It was exposed, all of this was exposed more or less last summer by one of the few reporters who actually gave serious coverage to the Iran-Contra hearings. By that I mean didn't just pick up the release that was handed out, but actually bothered to look up the documents. Alfonso Ciardi of the Miami Herald, back around July or August or so, he did a study of documents that had been released about the Office for Public Diplomacy, and he went to members of the Reagan administration, high administration officials, and asked them to explain, account for all of this, and they were quite frank and happy about it. They described this brainwashing operation as one of their most spectacular successes, and one which is correct if you think about elite opinion, was very successful in setting the discussion and debate about Central America, Nicaragua in particular. In fact, one high administration official described these operations to Ciardi as the kind of operations you would carry out in enemy territory. Now, that's a telling and accurate phrase. From the point of view of the administration, the population is enemy territory, and the people are inhabitants of enemy territory, and if you can't control them by force, you got to control them by propaganda. Now, again, that's not a position that's unique to this administration. It's a standard position. I go into it later if you like. It's long articulated in our history, back to the origins of our society, and it's very typical of other societies as well. But the Reagan administration is at an extreme point. And they were very proud of their successes in the war that they conducted in enemy territory at home, that is the ideological war. If you can't control the population by force, and you can't even control it by by propaganda, the state faces a dilemma. And there's about only one thing they can do in that case, and that is to go underground. And in fact, that's just what happened during the 1980s. Operation Truth worked very well. The Office of Public Diplomacy succeeded very well among elites who basically agreed with the policies anyhow, but it didn't work very well among the general population. In fact, it worked very badly. The population is more dissident and active today than any time in the last generation, contrary to what you often hear. There's not much articulation of this because the elites don't reflect it, and Congress is only a very weak reflection of it, the media virtually no reflection at all. But in the general population, there's plenty of activism and dissidence, and you can tell it, and the Reagan administration learned it very quickly. They were very quickly driven underground. They were driven underground by the opposition, the inhabitants of enemy territory, who were not going to tolerate the actions that they intended to carry out. Now, clandestine activities in any state are a pretty fair measure of the level of popular dissidence. Open violence, overt terrorism and aggression are far more efficient than clandestine terrorism. They just work a lot better. And furthermore, they don't bear the risk of exposure, which sort of causes all kinds of problems when it occasionally happens. So when a state turns to clandestine terrorism, clandestine violence, it's because it's forced to, and it's forced to by its own population. Clandestine activities are not a secret from anybody else. What are called covert operations are obviously not a secret to the victims. The kinds of operations that were, and so take, say, the operations that were partially exposed during the Iran-Contra hearings, plainly they weren't a secret to the victims. They weren't a secret to the mercenary states who were enlisted in the cause. They weren't a secret to shady businessmen like Richard Secord and the rest out to make a buck. In fact, they weren't even a secret to Congress and the press, if you want to know the truth. They were just at a low enough level so they could be suppressed. The only people that they were secret from was enemy population, the enemy territory at home. There they were a secret. The general population didn't know about them, and that's the point of clandestine operations. Clandestine operations are always, in part, a war against the domestic enemy. And when a state carries out extensive clandestine operations, it's very much afraid of its domestic enemy. And that's what happened in the 1980s. During the period August to January, August 87 to January 88, the Reagan administration, Congress, and the media, so elites generally, had a certain task. Their task was to demolish the Guatemala City Accords, to which they were opposed. The Accords were unacceptable to Washington, therefore they had to go. Well, how do you do it? Let me first notice that there were a number of features of the Accords which were completely unacceptable in Washington. The central feature of the Accords was the simultaneity feature. If you look at the way the Accords were structured, they were based on the idea that a number of things have to happen simultaneously in the various countries and so on. Now, that's unacceptable to the United States for two reasons. For one thing, the simultaneity requirement would place barriers in the way of the United States' attack against Nicaragua, and that's obviously unacceptable because the United States intends to continue the attack in one way or another. So that's out. And on that, there's an elite consensus. There's no debate over this in the media or in Congress, with very marginal exceptions. The simultaneity condition has to go. The Accords must be interpreted so that they apply to Nicaragua and Nicaragua alone. That's what that means. And that was done very effectively. There have been a number of studies of the media that give the exact numbers, but anybody who's been reading the papers or watching the tube knows the story. The idea that there have to be a number of things happening at once is unacceptable because it would place barriers to the U.S. attack. And since that's unacceptable, simultaneity condition, which is the core of the Accords, has to go. There's another reason why the simultaneity condition is unacceptable. It would place barriers on the U.S. attack against the populations of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Because the Accords call for measures to preserve liberty and security and freedom and access to free expression and so on and so forth, a whole range of measures which are completely unacceptable to the United States and cannot possibly be carried out unless without structural changes in those countries that would eliminate the whole security apparatus, which was designed with the support of the United States in the case of Guatemala and Honduras, and developed and imposed by the United States in the case of El Salvador, designed precisely for the purpose of preventing that to happen. It was designed for the purpose of traumatizing, repressing, torturing and killing, if necessary, the domestic population so that they won't cause any problems anymore. Those are the kinds of states where you don't worry about propaganda. You go after the jugular if people start to open their mouths. And that's what we did down there. And plainly, those measures cannot be stopped. There's no way for the Accords to apply to the U.S. terror states. It's inconceivable. They have to undergo a radical internal transformation. So therefore, the simultaneity requirement is unacceptable for that reason alone. Now, let me stress again that there's an elite consensus on this. For example, say, take the matter of freedom of the press.